Welcome to the Authenticating Network Users lesson. After completing this lesson, you will be able to achieve these objectives. Understand the importance of using Firewall authentication. Explain how FortiGate Firewall authentication works. Configure authentication. Monitor authentication. Firewall authentication requires users to verify their identity to FortiGate before they can access network resources. To authenticate, users must enter their credentials, such as a username and password. Without firewall authentication, the only information that FortiGate knows about the user that is originating the traffic is their source IP address, which FortiGate cannot use to determine the user's identity. To configure firewall authentication, you add a source user or user group to the firewall policy. This requires that users enter credentials at the beginning of the session. FortiGate then uses the identity of the user, along with the other rules in the firewall policy, to determine if the traffic should be allowed or denied. You can configure two types of firewall authentication on FortiGate: local password authentication and remote password authentication. The difference between these two methods is on whether the user credentials are stored on FortiGate or on a remote authentication server. The simplest method of authentication is local password authentication. User information is stored locally on the FortiGate device. This method works well for a single FortiGate installation. When you use firewall authentication, you need to create individual accounts for every user who requires access to the network. A local user account contains both the username and a password. You can also create local user groups to group together users who require the same level of access. You might want to group employees by business area, such as finance or HR, or by employee type, such as contractors or guests. In most cases, it is the best practice to use a group in a firewall policy rather than individual user accounts. You can also use local authentication for guest groups, which contain temporary user accounts that expire after a predetermined amount of time. Administrators can manually create guest accounts or create many guest accounts at once using randomly generated user IDs and passwords. This reduces administrator workload for large events. Once created, you can add accounts to the guest user group and associate the group with a firewall policy. When you use a remote authentication, FortiGate sends the user's entered credentials to an authentication server, such as FortiAuthenticator. If the server successfully authenticates the user, FortiGate then applies the matching firewall policy to the traffic. In remote authentication, FortiGate does not store all or sometimes any of the user information locally. Using remote authentication is desirable when multiple FortiGate devices need to authenticate the same users or user groups, or when adding FortiGate to a network that already contains an authentication server. To use firewall authentication, you need to include a user account or user group in the source definition for a firewall policy, along with the internal subnet. After doing this, when traffic matches the firewall policy, the user must authenticate before FortiGate grants access. To allow FortiGate to identify users requesting access, you can configure local firewall authentication. Expand each task to see the recommended process. First, create a user account on FortiGate to locally store user credentials. Second, create a user group based on the user's role or type and add the user to the group. Third, add the user group as the source for a firewall policy. Finally, verify the configuration by having the user successfully authenticate and monitor them using FortiGate logs and dashboards. To allow FortiGate to identify users requesting access, you can configure remote firewall authentication. Expand each task to see the recommended process. First, add the remote server in FortiGate. Second, create a user group and map authenticated remote users to this group. Third, add the user group as the source for a firewall policy. Finally, verify the configuration by having the user successfully authenticate and monitor them using FortiGate logs and dashboards. Let's us put these concepts into practice by completing the following lab simulation. You have completed this lesson. You are now able to understand the importance of using firewall authentication, explain how FortiGate firewall authentication works, configure authentication, monitor authentication.